Alright, so last week was spring break. Previous week, we started looking at measurements. We, I think, talked about the fundamentals of measurement. So the things that you're trying to explain, how do we measure them? What kind of tools do we use? What do the measurements show us? And so today we are going to continue doing some of this. So we talked about measurements as ways of representing variables in some way that makes sense and that corresponds with how we are going to test those particular concepts. So, for example, if you're going to test the height of students, you are going to specify that you're going to use feet, inches, centimeters, and so on. So what I want us to do today is to maybe look at measurements, some of the dangers to measurements, some of the concerns, but also how we associate two things together. So for example, if someone asks you what is the relationship between say military spending and welfare and how they relate to each other, you should probably be able to do that. We talked about all the ways you can measure the distance from this building to Wilson Hall. Some of them are more effective than others, and so you want to use the proper measurements for the proper concept. If someone told you the distance between NGE and Wilson Hall is 20 pounds, I think you'd be very confused and clearly sort of figure out that this person doesn't know what they are measuring. We talked about specification of the concepts that you are actually using, so that is important. We then talked about other concepts. So for example, reliability and validity. And so we are going to be looking into those concepts in just a little while. Not sure what is happening today. But so we also mentioned that, for example, reliability is the ability, ability is if someone tells you they're going to do something, you expect them to do that something. If they do something, then you can show that they are actually reliable. They do what they say they were going to do. We talked briefly about validity. What is validity? Now, all of these concepts are going to be included in this presentation somewhere. So we briefly mentioned, we actually didn't mention levels of measurement, and so we'll be talking about those and the different scales. There are quite a number of scales that we shall be talking about. So we talked about measurement being the systematic observation of phenomena and their representation by scores. If you say there are many students, what is many? And so many students probably depends on the context in which you're talking about. If it's a football game and there are 10 students, I don't think we can say there are many students. However, if it's maybe a protest and there are 4,000 out of 5,000 students, then you can say there are many students. So sort of think about what this systematic observation and representation by scores or numerals speak to. We talked about the accuracy of measurements, how measurements need to be accurate and precise as possible. So you also want to use the proper measurement tools. I think if you measure something like the length of a book using a kilometer or using Google Maps, that is probably it's not a very effective or good measure. We also talked about the measurement as a bridge between the proposed explanations and the empirical world in which they explain the impacts of measurements on findings, different measurements. And so we are not just talking about physical measurements, we're also talking about measurement of phenomena. And so when I think, mentioned that when you are doing measurements, you need to develop operational definitions of what you're using. I think we have beat this example to death, but what is youth? How do we measure youth? How do we measure adults? How do we measure? So that concept that you are trying to think about. Now, if you are measuring a concept such as democracy, you can't just say if a country calls itself a democracy, then we are going to assume it's a democracy. There are other ways to measure those concepts like freedom. So, for example, the North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So that is, now there's this view that if a country calls itself democratic in its name, it's probably not. So Laos People's Democratic Republic of the Congo. So again, what is the concept you're measuring and what is a good measure of that concept? What is the operational definition? And so we talk about operationalization in that context of that research. This idea or this concept means precisely this. And so have a precise meaning of a concept. But also indicate the measures that you're going to use. In the beginning when we started, I think we talked about state failure. And so what are the dimensions of state failure? Now, we might disagree with some of them, but at least that's an example of definitions of state failure. When you look at the Freedom House, their measurement of freedoms around the world, they have 3 dimensions, like internet freedom, political rights, and maybe civil rights. So again, these are people who have specified what they are measuring with what, and how you're going to know that they are measuring what they say they are measuring. We talked about the accuracy of measurements, so they must be as accurate as possible, because inaccurate measurements may cause erroneous conclusions. And so this is especially important with things like medication, or if you're building a building. You do not want to have the wrong measurements, like the building doesn't have the strength and suddenly it collapses on people. So we talk about spurious relationships. So when we think that there is a relationship between 2 concepts, but there really isn't. So that is what we refer to as spurious correlations, and you do not really want that. We talked about accuracy, so reliability and precision, which is measured by validity. I don't think we talked about the threats to validity and reliability, but examples of reliability. So your coworker comes to work on time or does not come to work on time, then you know they are not reliable. So there are threats to when we do these social experiments. We talked about how if you're counting 1,000 ballots, there could be factors that interfere with the count. So for example, if you're interrupted and you have to go back to start counting again. Some ballots may be blown onto the floor. Some maybe if you're transferring, if you found 900 ballots, you might find that you wrote down 995. I think we saw this a lot in 2000 in the 2020 election. Another election coming up, so we probably going to see some more drama. Now, in theory, when you have a reliable and valid measure, people should find the same results. But we also talk about aging. So changes, technological changes, environmental changes. I mentioned, for example, that George W. Bush had a very low approval rating before 9/11, and then after 9/11, his approval rating went up. We did talk about the how we measure reliability, so test, retest, pre-test, post-test, alternative form method. So you create like 10 questions that measure one concept, and then you administer 5 to one group and 5 to another. Split half method, sometimes it fails, kind of like you have 2 measures and you split them. Now, when we talk about, for example, the test retest method, we assume that maybe learning has not taken place, or growth. Let's simply call it growth. But occasionally there's growth that is going to change the results that you will find. So we have to be cognizant of that. When we talk about alternative form method, we are thinking about measuring the same attribute more than once, so 2 different measures of the same concept. So an example is measuring liberalism. You think about, how can I know that someone identifies with liberalism or is politically liberal? You could ask them about their support for military spending. But what if they were in the military but they're still liberal? So they may support increased military spending, but not support any other thing that is identified with liberalism. So this can also, and we have to be aware of these threats to validity and reliability. But so the idea is that you ask the same respondents questions at 2 different times using the same set of questions. The first time and then the second set of, so you have 2 sets of questions and you're going to ask them 2 times. The first time with the first set of questions and the second time with the second set of questions. But again, this assumes that nothing major happens. Personally, I articulated this, maybe I should do some more work on it. But I think of what I call critical events. And my view is that critical events can change how people respond to things. 9/11 was a critical event. It changed how people saw or the level of support for the president. So there may be another example of a critical event would be probably Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invasion of the US or attacking the US. That would be a critical event. So for example, there had been a study done about people's support for the war, the Second World War, and it found that only about 17% of Americans supported the US even helping, not going to war, like nobody wanted to go to war. But after December 7th, 1941, most Americans were just rushing to fill these recruitment stations. So critical events can change our perceptions. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing changed some things about, or the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism, or the 2009 recession, or more recently, COVID-19. COVID-19 really kind of increased, and sometimes you see these effects, like the attitudes towards Asians, and you probably have heard of this AAPI, Stop Asian Hate. So critical events can change different things. So even if you're measuring the same concept using the same group of respondents at 2 different times, you might find that the scores are influenced by other environmental issues. Now, the split halves method, as we mentioned, you develop a measure and then you split it into 2, and then you apply it to to a group. And so, for example, if you have a measure of liberalism or conservatism, and then you split it. So generally, we agree that things like social security, welfare, military spending, these are issues that can tell you whether someone leans conservative or liberal. And so you can develop those measures and then compare the results. So half the questions would represent one measure and half the other questions would represent the second measure. Now, in terms of reliability, we, I think, talked about this as being the extent to which an experiment or test or any measuring procedure yields the same results. So you do want the same outcome every time without ecological interference, which is what I think we might consider to be growth. So we want consistent results. If we are testing medication, we want the consistent result. If we are testing road conditions, we want the same results in repeated trials. Again, we have to think about ecological interference. So if someone is doing a poll using and is dialing people, we have to think about what was the first poll dialing. Are you dialing home phones or are you dialing cell phones? But so when we sort of think about, again, if you're testing medication and you find different results, does it work? Does it not? A good example is actually the malaria vaccine. So the malaria vaccine has been tested for probably about 70 to 80 years. Only now are they finding the results to approach about 40% effectiveness, which is probably very low. Now, when COVID was around, however we feel about it, there were questions of the efficacy of the vaccines. Did they stop, or was it a big hoax? And so you will see numbers bandied out. So for example, confidence intervals. I am 95% confident that this medication will work. Now, if someone tells you that, it's probably better than if they say, I am 60% confident that this will work. Think about other things. If you have flown on, say, a plane, and the pilot tells you, I'm only 60% confident we'll get there, I probably would want to get off, because there's that other 40% of will we or won't we? So again, this is reliability. You want the same outcomes all the time in repeated trials of whatever it is that you're doing. So reliability is the idea that a measure measures what it is supposed to measure. And again, this is where I say you can't measure weight with a ruler. It makes no sense. So think about reliability as the degree of correspondence between the measure and the concept that it is thought to measure. So measure height with a ruler, centimeters, meters, feet. Measure weight with pounds, kilos, grams, and so on. I think we may have mentioned the challenges of how to measure certain things, especially social concepts like whether a city has a lot of crime. Depends on who you ask. If you ask someone who has been mugged, they will obviously say, "Oh yeah, this city is dangerous. There is so much crime." If you ask a resident who has lived there for like 50 years and nothing has ever happened to them, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, this is the safest city to live in." If you ask the police department, they might, depending on whether they want more money or more tourists, they will either tell you there's more crime or less crime. And so you have to keep these things in mind when you're thinking about validity. And so you have to sort of think outside the box. So for example, and I don't know if this is necessarily a sensitive topic, but think about the Clary report, Jean Clary, who was murdered in a university, I think it's like maybe in Pennsylvania, that then eventually led to the Clary report on crimes on university campuses. Now, well, in theory, you shouldn't fudge those kinds of numbers, but if you want your university to attract students, you will probably try to downplay some of these things. Absolutely a terrible idea. Um, but if you ask students, you might find a different response. And so sort of think about the information that you're looking for and the best way to find it. Because again, if you ask a university, I hope they give you the right information all the time. And so again, think about a student who proposes to measure weight using a ruler. That is absolutely not a good way to measure weight. So in terms of validity, there are a number of types of validity. So the first one is face validity. And so when we talk about face validity, we are talking about the meaning of the concept that is being measured. When we say democracy, what do we mean? When we talk about conservatism or liberalism, what do we mean? So these concepts have been defined by other people, and this is why, for example, I recommend that you use other people's definitions so you don't have to come up with your own. But so, for example, if you think about a study on party identification, it would be very odd to say Democrats are conservative. Now, there's a spectrum on Democrats. So there are like conservative Democrats, who are often called the blue dog Democrats, especially in Congress. And then there are liberal Democrats. There are liberal-leaning Republicans, and there are ultra-conservative Republicans. But so if someone said conservative Republicans, for example, support open borders, that would be like, no, that is not what we have generally seen. So think about the meaning of the concept that is being measured and the information that you collect and whether it's germane to that concept. If you go around and people tell you they are liberal Democrats and they support, for example, they do not support women's right to choose, you would have serious questions about that. Now, some people will not necessarily fit into any specific category. In fact, it has been found that a lot of us are very, like what we might identify as liberal. When we are asked about specific values, this will lean towards a different ideology. So it's important to maybe keep that in mind. But also think about political discourse. So today we hear a lot about radical Democrats, including the ones who are very, very progressive. And so the question is progressivism the same as radicalism? And also, are there non-radical Democrats today? I don't think I have seen those kinds of discussions. So when we talk about face validity, we also have to think about some of the challenges to face validity. So, for example, graduate schools require the GRE. Law schools will require the LSAT. Business schools will require the GMAT or maybe sometimes the Miller tests. Now, in theory, tests are supposed to be non-biased. They are supposed to be objective. They are supposed to be, if you have access to the material, you should probably be able to pass. But is that necessarily true? Now, for example, the GRE, the Graduate Record Exam, has been thought to reflect more middle-class white society rather than being an objective measure of your ability to succeed in graduate school. In fact, there are few tests, I think, that will, because some people become very good test takers. That doesn't mean that they actually know the stuff or that they are going to succeed in graduate school unless it's based on tests. So if you tell them to be creative, probably not going to happen. And so we have to sort of think about they measure, does GRE measure the likelihood of succeeding in school? And so there are questions about these kinds of things. Now, so that is face validity. Is it measuring what it says it is measuring? The second concept in measurement is, or in validity is face, or rather content validity. And so content validity refers to the full domain or meaning of a particular concept, and then ensuring that you're measuring the full domain of that concept. So for example, if you're measuring political partisanship and you want to know about liberalism, if you only ask people if they support Social Security, that is valid, but it's not the full domain of liberalism. Now, there's actually examples that have been given that are very interesting. When American society has conversations about welfare and about government spending on social programs, for example, Medicare is especially, not Medicare, Medicaid. People will often not be aware of what Medicaid does, or at least they won't think that it affects them. And then they have a grandparent in a nursing home who is probably supplemented by Medicaid. And then when you actually make them aware of that, they're like, oh, well, maybe the government should keep, paying Medicaid for, elderly people and so on. And so sort of think about the idea that you would understand liberalism based on just Social Security. And so you will find that I might be a very conservative Republican, but my grandparent is in my parent is in a nursing home and uses Medicaid. Then I'm more likely to support Medicaid and maybe increase military spending and less immigration. And so, but again, if my grandparent is being taken care of by immigrants, and she likes it, that might bias my opinion towards, that particular political aspect of this country. But so you want to measure liberalism as a full domain, and you have to think about what it is that is encompassed in realism. And so, for example, if you sort of think about freedoms, you think about political rights and civil rights. So think about what you're measuring and be sure that you're measuring the entire concept, not just elements of the concept. Now, so face validity, content validity to include everything that is involved in that content, but also construct validity. And so construct validity actually has two elements to it. So think about measuring liberalism, as I've mentioned. So I want to measure whether a student is, their political partisanship leans towards liberalism. And so I might ask them about support for women's right to choose. But I could also ask them about their level of support for welfare. So the level of support for welfare generally is thought to correct, well, maybe that's, maybe support for welfare and maybe Medicare. Because if you don't have money, a lot of money, then you want the government to be more supportive. And so if I find someone who supports welfare, I might also find that they support something like Medicare. And so I'm measuring one thing, but I'm using a different thing to measure the thing that I wanted to measure first. So the complex explanation is a measure of a concept is related to a measure of another concept with which the original concept is thought to be related. So welfare and food pantries. So if I measure the utilization of food pantries, it is likely that that person who says, yeah, food pantries, will also support welfare. So again, sometimes this is because of access. Now, there is two types of validity, so convergent construct validity. So two concepts that ought to be related positively. So for example, welfare and food pantries, or welfare and support for welfare and support for Medicaid. So those are positively correlated. Now, it would be very, very unusual to find a country that has democracy and abuses human rights. Maybe I should take that back. There are countries that abuse individuals' rights, sort of on isolated scale. But I don't think that we could say, for example, Cuba has a great human rights record, even though they have free healthcare. So maybe that is a human right. But North Korea, we couldn't say that, North Korea is a beacon of human rights. Literally, they starved their people to death. So positive manner, political efficacy, political participation, or political participation with voting, you might find those things correlated. Education and income are, so sometimes you can measure income, and then unless someone invented something, and a lot of those inventions are maybe made in college, education can be a convergent construct validity element of income. Now, the negative correlation would be, for example, autocracy and human rights. I don't think you're going to find those two things going positively together. When one goes negatively, then the other will go positively. If there's a lot of human rights abuses, then you will probably not find democracy. Now, the discriminant divergent validity, and these are things that you might not necessarily use in your research, involves two measures that theoretically are expected to be not to be related. And so the correlation is weak. So for example, in this country, we think that support for the military is not very strongly correlated with support for welfare. So if you find people who necessarily support welfare, you will find that they may not support, people should support the military. I think it does great work. But so we are going to also talk about these low correlations and see what they mean. So in terms of rethinking the ideas that we are talking about, so think about GRE. Is it a good measure of the likelihood of success in college? Now, if we take practical examples, I don't know if you submitted SAT scores, but it's not like we don't see people with near perfect ACT scores who don't do very well in college. People can be good test takers, and so we have to think about those kinds of issues. Now, there is a different kind of association which is called interitem, and so we think about the similarity of different measures to sort of figure out. So for example, if I'm measuring liberalism, I can't do that with just one measure. I want to look at different measures. So support for the military, Medicaid, women's right to choose. And so if I see that those things, those concepts, or the respondents are responding in the way I expect that they would respond if they are liberals or if they are conservatives, then that is more effective than I have one measure I am just going to ask people about their support for the military. What if your parents are in the military, but you're still a liberal? I mean, I would think you'd support the military because your parents are in it. Um, but I need to look at all these other measures that will tell me if you are generally trending in the way I expect that measure to trend. So again, think about this example that is given, developing a valid measure of liberalism, so attitudes towards welfare, military spending, abortions, social security benefits, affirmative action, progressive tax income, school vouchers, protection of the rights of the accused. And so, for example, I can already begin to guesstimate what someone who identifies as liberal, their position would be on welfare, support for welfare, military spending, less support for military spending, abortion, right to choose, support. Social security benefit levels, they would probably support increased social security benefit levels. They would probably support affirmative action. They would support a progressive income tax. The more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. School vouchers, they probably not support school vouchers. And protection of the rights of the accused, you would find higher levels of support of protection of the rights of the accused. And so if you find those things that I've mentioned in the way that I've mentioned them, then you can begin to see that this is a valid measure of liberalism. And so the interitem association is, how does this measure associate with this other measure, and what do we generally know about those measures? So these are ways to sort of think about. Now, tests of validity may not be as reliable as those of tests of validity may not be as reliable as of validity may not be as important as those of reliability. And here's why. So you want the same outcome every time. If you are making medications, you want to know that the medication, so if the medication only works in, for example, Mongolian people, is that good medication or is it not? If medication only cures people some of the time, is that good medication or is it not? And so you kind of, like, people can have different opinions or positions on social welfare and liberalism and conservatism and those kinds of things, which is probably not as important as maybe getting the same outcome every time. Here's maybe a good example of reliability. If police officers did what they are hired to do without biases, and so we assume that they don't have bias, but we all know that they kind of do, and that these biases have outcomes that sometimes are very negative for certain groups of people. But if we could reliably know that police officers are going to apply the laws and the rules without personal bias or other, things, then we would think that policing in this country is fair. But today, we cannot say that. We see, now validity is more difficult because, when we talk about, for example, support for welfare, we don't even talk about how much support for welfare. Now, you may have heard of these groups and cities that are beginning to, so instead of having welfare and work requirements and, you can only spend stuff on this and that, they're giving you a pile of money and you spend it on the way you want. Now, of course, there's probably people spending it on, I don't know, tickets to Disneyland or something. But that is not necessary. In every experiment, there are outliers. And so we can't stop doing those things just because some people are seen at the casino. So when we think about the relationship between one concept and another, we generally refer to correlation matrices. And so the correlation goes from +1, which is perfectly correlated, to -1, which is perfect negative correlation. So, for example, I'd expect that there's a very high level of correlation between military support and stopping immigration. I would also expect that there's very high levels of correlation between military support and maybe religion. Now, I am not necessarily asserting that one leads to another, but there are those kinds of. Now, in terms of sample correlation matrices, this is, well, where is this? Okay, so this is an example. So you can look at, so if you're measuring the effect of studying on exam score, sleeping, school rating, IQ score, you can begin to see, so for example, the hours spent studying and the exam score are, wait, they have a very high correlation. Now, the one means it's the same thing. So, for example, school rating, hours spent studying, you'd expect that to be the same thing. So, it's a 1. Hours spent studying versus hours spent sleeping. So, the more hours you sleep, the less hours you spend studying. And so, you can sort of, so for most people, a correlation that is above 0.85% is near perfect. So for example, if hours spent studying an exam score they show a correlation of 1, it means hours spent studying will always produce higher scores. Now there are other examples, and I don't know if this will, I think it was a car. So miles per gallon, the number of cylinders, displacement, horsepower, weight, gears, and carburetors. I don't know, unless you work in the auto industry, why you would need this kind of information. But so you can sort of see these kinds of relationships. Now again, MPG is the same. The number of cylinders and the MPGs, you can sort of see the relationship. Now, let's maybe think about, when we think about validity, and we'll look at other correlation matrices maybe later on, when we think about the dangers or the threats to reliability and validity, so if we want to ask people about their income and their political views, we can ask people how much money they make. But think about maybe our own lives. Often we don't know how much money people make, including our co-workers. So if you're doing an interview and you go around a certain neighborhood and you're asking people, so how much money do you make? And are you a Democrat? They might tell you more because they are like, does this person think I'm broke? Or do I need to impress them? Now, if it's someone who is giving away stuff for free, then you want to tell them you make less money so you can get stuff for free. So respondents may also not know how much money other family members make or guess incorrectly. So think about a household survey, for example, the census. If I'm making, like if I, and this is a terrible thought, if I live with a spouse and I don't really want them to know how much money I make and we are being asked together, like if I have a side hustle, I might not tell the truth. So again, we don't always know how much money people make. So people might overestimate or select wrong categories when you're filling in questionnaires. Interviewers may also circle the wrong categories. And so, for example, this is just simply you're asking people how much money they make, and you see all these kinds of threats. Data entry personnel may touch the wrong numbers, and then you have the incorrect numbers. So you, for example, if you're putting in, say, $50,000, you find someone input $500,000, which then skews the whole question. Dishonest interviewers may incorrectly guess. So like if you didn't complete a survey, I might just put in numbers there based on maybe the average of that region or other numbers that you probably entered. People may not know who to include. So this was actually seen in 2020. So the Census Bureau sends out these surveys and people are supposed to fill them. Now, this past census, there was a question of whether to include people who are legally in the United States or just citizens. Now, here's a challenge with that. If you only include citizens, what about diplomats, students who may have children who go to these schools? Again, think about the purpose of the census. It is to apportion revenues so that you don't have schools that have too much money and others that do not have. And so if you say you're only going to count the people who are legally here, you're not going to have the full number. So for example, you're going to say the city of Norfolk has 50,000 people, but there are 20,000 people who are undocumented, and they have 10,000 kids. And so this will put a strain on, when the federal government is apportioning money, it's going to put a strain on the resources that the city of Norfolk has to provide education and other things. So again, which family members to include? What if you have a cousin who stays with you two weeks of the month and then goes to some place else? So income that is on the border between two categories can also be a challenge to determine how to enter it, as is income that is not perfectly legal. If I have a side hustle making available gummies or weed or other things, at least when it was illegal, do I include that information? Am I telling people I'm selling weed? Because we've seen some people who make a lot of money, even though we don't see them at a day job, even though that might be a day job. So think about the threats that we see in these kinds of so when you're doing social science research, you have to remember that there are threats to, like, you can never be sure, even if, and this is why we say with a high degree of probability rather than I am certain that A, B, C, D. So again, these are things to keep. But there are other additional issues. So for example, if you apply the same measure to the same people at two different times, what we call ecological interference, like growth changes, will make a difference in what you see. So as I mentioned, not entirely legal income, trying to interview to impress the interviewer, that you're making more money than you are. All of these are examples of threats, underestimation, those kinds of things. Now, when we sort of think about, so for example, think about socialism, and this has been a question that has perplexed most researchers, especially recently. So socialism and communism have maybe a parent in common. Most Americans actively dislike socialism. But young people, strangely, both like Bernie Sanders, who is not close to them in age, but also like socialism. And so these are very confounding. And maybe it's because their parents and grandparents grew up during the Cold War, and so there was always the threat of nuclear annihilation by the communist nations. But there is a very high level of affinity to socialism, or at least people expressing positive view towards socialism, than at any time in American history, or than with most of the other generations. So if you look at the numbers, and so again, do young people know what socialism is, or are they just disillusioned with capitalism? So again, when we think about threats to reliability, and we have to sort of think about that. Now, we are going to then next move, maybe on Tuesday next week, into the precision of measurements, because we have to make sure that measurements are precise, they are accurate, they are using the proper measurement tools, they should contain as much information as possible. And so sometimes in surveys, you will see people collect information and you're thinking, why are they asking this? Why are they asking about gender? Why are they asking about height? And it's maybe a survey about, I don't know, whether you like basketball. I would expect that taller people like basketball because they probably played it. But so you want as much information as possible, but you don't want so much information that I look at the survey and I'm like, I'm just going to guess the categories and the different things. And so we have to think about the precision of measurements, accuracy, precision, but also think about the type of information that we are looking for in these measurements, types of comparisons, what claims we are willing to make when we assign numbers to measurements. So for example, sometimes we collect information so that instead of saying POS 333 students, so I can say the gentlemen in POS 333 or the ladies in POS 333 if it's germane. So for example, if I'm examining the question of whether we support the right of women to choose, which I hope we all do, but so when we are assigning this, when we get that much information, then we can drill down in detail what claims we are making. Now, we shall be talking about the different levels of measurements, but for starters, and they often have different, you'll find different definitions and descriptions. So my favorite representation of the 4 levels of measurements is noir, which is French for black, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And so this goes from the most basic. We have talked about nominal measurements, which are sort of like things like names, dog breeds, color. So names don't really, they differentiate things. They don't necessarily add quality to or quantity to them. Even though, for example, think about if you're going to commencement. People are called probably by college, by degree, and then by department, and then by department and then degree, and then by names. So again, if you think about this from a research perspective or research methods perspective, these are nominal categories. So School of Business probably comes before College of Liberal Arts and comes before College of Science, engineering and something else. So again, think about where we use these measurements and what they mean. So nominal, interval, ratio, in nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Now, some people will call them numeric and categorical. So nominal, ordinal, interval would be continuous, and discrete is is the ratio. So again, let this not distract or confuse you as to what they mean. Now, again, we talked about some of these things like discrete variables can only take one value, names, number of quarters in a jar. You can't say I have 1.5 quarters, even though you can probably split. How you do that? Now, if you're doing averages, if you have 5 jars with different types of coins, you can do averages of 2.3 and so on. Number of cars in a parking lot is a complete number. Points on a 10-point rating scale. Ages on birthday cards. Also, I don't know if you have siblings or kids in your family who say they are 4.5. Now, I think maybe someone should consider making cards for like 4.5-year-olds. I think they would make money like twice a year. Now, so again, when you think about a continuous variable, height is an example. You can be 182.5 centimeters, 182.55, 182.56. And so on. So this is another way to think about variables. So again, you can divide them into quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative, they just give you a quality. So names, hair color, dog breeds, they are qualities, even though we can then assign numbers and say, for example, Alaskan Huskies, my favorite type breed of dog, is so anyone watch the National Dog Show on Thanksgiving and the competitions and some of those measures of which dog is most obedient, which dog is, so you can have attributes to those, but again, sort of think about qualitative versus quantitative, and then continuous variables, height and time, and discrete variables. So for example, quantity, and account numbers. This is another representation of the variables: categorical, qualitative, and numerical, which are quantitative. So think about quantity. We shall talk about scales, but it's useful to sort of think about ordinal, like you order things. When you look at these surveys, you see satisfied, dissatisfied, or rather very dissatisfied, dissatisfied, neither satisfied, or very satisfied. So you can assign numbers to this. The numbers don't necessarily mean anything, but they distinguish those categories. Now, again, when we talk about those various variables, we can, for example, talk about like when we talk about kids, you can have 2 kids, you can have 2.5 kids. Even when people are expecting, we don't say I have 2.5 kids. So again, sort of think about what type of variables you will be looking into and what they entail for research and measurement. And so I think we are going to conclude this conversation here. On during the next period, we shall be looking at these levels of measurement in detail. So again, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, and some of how they are represented on different scales. So we shall do that during the next